The envelope sat on the table like an accusation. Thomas Brennan stood in his kitchen as dawn broke cold across the Montana territory. The lamp burned low on the wooden table, its flame trembling in the draft that seeped through the window cracks. Frost painted the glass in delicate patterns, nature's art rendered in ice and silence. He had been staring at the letter for 2 days now, unable to believe she meant it. 3 words in her careful handwriting: return to sender. The floorboards creaked behind him. Papa? Rose stood in the doorway, still in her nightgown. 7 years old, with her mother's auburn hair and his own gray eyes. She clutched her cloth doll against her chest, small fingers white from gripping too hard. Is Miss Grace coming back? She had been asking the same question for 2 months. He had run out of answers that felt true. Thomas looked at his daughter, then at the letter, then toward the window where the sun broke pale and distant over the western ridge. The mountains stood eternal against the sky, witnesses to every promise made and broken in this hard country. He did not answer. He set the letter down and walked toward the barn. Rose followed barefoot on the cold ground, wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. She watched him saddle his horse with practiced hands, cinch bridle bedroll tied behind. He moved with purpose. Now the hesitation of the last 2 days burned away by something harder than doubt. Where are you going, Papa? West. To find someone. He paused, one hand on the saddle horn, and looked at his daughter. Her face held hope, so fragile it hurt to see. Miss Grace. The name hung between them like smoke. Yes, he said. He lifted her onto the porch where their neighbor Martha Doyle waited to watch her. The old woman's eyes asked the question, her mouth did not. Thomas just nodded once. Martha nodded back, understanding passing between them in the way of people who had seen too much to waste words. He mounted his horse. Rose stood on the porch, wrapped in her blanket, small against the rising light. Her eyes were wide and wet, but she did not cry. 7 years old, and already she knew the weight of goodbye. He looked back and saw his daughter's face, trusting and afraid all at once. A man's word is his bond, his father had told him once. Keep it or die trying. He had written Grace a letter weeks after she left. Told her she belonged, told her to come home. She had sent it back unopened. Those 3 words written across the seal in ink that might as well have been blood. But a man's word was his bond. The hoofbeats echoed steady as prayer across the frozen yard. He did not look back again. The road stretched empty before him. Thomas had ridden it 100 times for cattle or supplies, but never for a woman who did not want to be found. The afternoon sun hung pale behind gray clouds. Wind cut sharp through the pine country, carrying the smell of coming snow. His horse moved steady beneath him, used to long days and rough country. Thomas let the rhythm settle his thoughts, the familiar creak of leather and the sound of hooves on hard earth. 6 months ago, though, it felt like another lifetime now. The memory came unbidden, as memories do when a man rides alone. She had arrived in April, when the world was waking from winter's grip. Thomas had been in the corral repairing fence rails that the snow had warped and broken. The sound of a wagon made him look up. A woman sat on the bench seat, reins held in capable hands, dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, a leather medical bag beside her. Grace Merrick, though he did not know her name yet. She was passing through, hired by a neighbor 3 ranches over to tend a sick child. But when she drove past his place, she saw Rose on the porch. Even from the road, she could see the fever flush on the little girl's face, the way she lay too still in the afternoon warmth. Grace stopped without asking payment. She climbed down from her wagon and walked up to the porch as if she had every right to be there. Thomas followed, confused and somehow grateful all at once. How long has she been like this? Grace asked, not looking at him. Her hand pressed against Rose's forehead, fingers gentle but certain. Since last night. I didn't know what to do. I'm not good at this. Boil water, clean cloths, whatever herbs you have. She did not ask his name, did not ask permission. Just stepped into his house like she had been born there, like she belonged in a place she had never seen before. And her hands, they knew exactly what to do. Grace stayed 3 days nursing his daughter through the scarlet fever with the cool cloths and herbal teas, in a gentle presence that made the house feel less empty than it had since Sarah died. Rose recovered. Grace smiled, and somehow she never left. She stayed through the summer, mending and teaching Rose to read, planting a garden that bloomed wild and beautiful. She shared their meals and their silence in the quiet rhythm of days that felt for the first time in 3 years, like living instead of just surviving. Thomas had fallen in love watching her braid his daughter's hair. He had fallen in love hearing her laugh at Rose's stories about the mean rooster who terrorized the barn cat. He had fallen in love with the way she looked at sunrise standing in the doorway, with coffee in her hands, like she belonged there, like she had always been there, like the house had been waiting for her all along. Then one September morning she was gone. No warning, no argument, just a note on the table in that same careful handwriting. I don't belong here. Forget me. The memory faded as Thomas crossed into rougher terrain. He had waited a week thinking she would come back. Then another. By the third week he had written the letter. Short, honest, desperate. Grace, Rose asks for you every night. I tell her you had to go, but I don't believe it. I think you're scared. I think someone told you once you weren't enough. They lied. Come home. We're waiting. He had sent it to the town she had mentioned once, the place she said she came from. Sweetwater Creek, 2 weeks' ride west through mountain passes and high plains. It came back unopened, returned to sender. Thomas pulled the letter from his coat, now the envelope worn from handling. He could not bring himself to leave it behind, though he did not know why. Maybe proof, maybe penance. He tucked it away and looked ahead at the empty road. You carved toys for my daughter, he said to the wind, to the mountains, to the sky that heard everything and answered nothing. You taught her to read. You made us whole. His voice carried into the pines and vanished. If you think I'm not coming, you don't know Montana men. The road bent west. He followed it, but Thomas was not alone on the trail. That first night camped beneath an outcrop of stone, he felt it. The sensation of being watched, the crawl of awareness along his spine that 15 years as a marshal had taught him never to ignore. He did not build his fire large, did not settle into sleep too quickly. His hand stayed near his rifle, and his eyes scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing moved, nothing showed itself, but something was there. In the morning he found tracks, boot prints, not animal. Someone had circled his camp in the night, staying just beyond the light watching. Thomas stood over those tracks for a long moment reading what they told him. A man heavy, experienced enough to move quietly. Someone who knew how to track and when to wait. A hunter. But hunting what and why he thought of Martha's warning before he left. She had pulled him aside while Rose played in the yard, her voice low and urgent. Tom, I have to tell you something about Grace. What about her? The week before she left, I saw her in town, talking to a man, rough-looking fellow, mean in the eyes. They were arguing, I think. Grace looked scared. Did you recognize him? No, but there's more. Word around town is someone's been asking about you. A man with the look of a bounty hunter asking about Thomas Brennan, the former marshal. Thomas had felt ice in his gut then. His past, it seemed, was not as buried as he had hoped. 3 years ago, he had helped convict a man named Frank Morrison. Bank robber killer, the kind of man who left bodies behind like breadcrumbs. The trial had been swift, the sentence harsh. Life in the territorial prison. But men like Frank Morrison had friends, had money, had long memories and the patience of snakes. If Frank had escaped, if he had put a price on Thomas's head, then this tracker in the darkness made sense. Bounty hunters did not care about right or wrong. They cared about gold. Thomas mounted his horse as the sun broke over the eastern hills. He would ride hard today, put distance between himself and whoever followed. But in the back of his mind, he knew the truth. The hunter would not give up. Not for $500. Not when the trail was fresh and the prey was moving slow, burdened by purpose and promise. So be it. Thomas touched the pocket of his coat, felt the small wooden horse nestled there. Rose had pressed it into his hands that morning, tears streaming down her face. Take it, Papa, so Miss Grace knows we still have it. The horse was small, intricate, carved with a skill that spoke of patience and love. Grace had made it for Rose sitting by the fire one evening with a piece of pine and a small knife. She had worked for 3 nights, shaping ears and mane and hooves with careful precision. Rose had cried when Grace gave it to her. Now Rose had given it to him, and the weight of it in his pocket was heavier than gold. Grace had not left because she did not care. She had left because she cared too much and thought she was not worthy of it. She had run from love, the way wounded animals run from kindness, not from cruelty, but from fear of the cost. She's scared, he realized. Not heartless, just scared. The knowledge settled in his chest like certainty. Whatever had driven Grace away, it was not lack of feeling. It was too much feeling, and a lifetime of learning that good things did not last. Thomas Brennan had been a lawman long enough to know that fear made people do strange things, made them run when they should stand, made them push away the very things they needed most. But he had also been a father long enough to know that love was patient, that it waited, that it pursued even when pursuit seemed foolish. The land did not lie, neither should a man. His father had taught him that. Words he had lived by all his life, words that echoed now in the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on stone. I'm coming, Grace, ready or not. Lightning split the sky ahead, miles away but coming closer. Thunder rolled after the sound of heaven's drums. He rode toward both into weather that promised storms and cold, and the kind of suffering that tested whether a man's promises were just words or something more. The trading post appeared like Providence, one light burning steady against the coming dark. Thomas had been riding 7 days. The storm had passed, but it left him hollow and aching, the kind of tired that settles into bones and does not leave. When he saw the lamplight glowing through the musk, he nearly wept with relief. The building was small log walls, a porch sagging on one side, smoke rising from a stone chimney. A painted sign read Hal's Trading Post in letters worn almost to nothing. Thomas dismounted and tied his horse beside 2 others already there. The door opened before he could knock. An old woman stood in the frame, small and sturdy, with white hair pulled back and eyes that missed nothing. "Storm's coming," she said. "You'll want shelter." It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am, I'd be grateful." "Then get in here before you freeze." Inside, warmth hit him like a physical thing. A fire crackled in the hearth. The room smelled of coffee and venison and wood smoke smells that meant safety and civilization in a land that offered neither freely. An old man sat by the fire, weathered as driftwood, with a long beard and hands that had worked a lifetime. He looked up when Thomas entered, nodded once and returned to his pipe. "Walter," the woman called, "see to his horse." The man stood without complaint and headed outside. The woman pointed Thomas toward the fire. "Sit, I'm Helen Howe. That's my husband. You'll eat and sleep here tonight." No argument. Thomas wanted to protest, to say he could not afford to stop, that Grace was still days away and every hour mattered. But his body had other ideas. He sat. Helen brought him coffee in a tin cup, then a bowl of stew that tasted better than anything he had had in a week. Walter returned, shaking rain from his coat. "Good horse you got, fed and watered." "Thank you." They ate in comfortable silence for a time, the kind of silence that exists between people who understand that not everything needs to be said. Then Helen asked, her voice careful but kind, "Where you headed with such determination?" Thomas hesitated. He did not know these people, did not owe them explanations. But something in Helen's eyes, something in the way she watched him with the patience of someone who had seen much and judged little, made him speak. He told them the whole story. Grace, the letter, the 2 weeks of riding. He did not know why he was telling strangers, except that Helen's eyes were kind and he was too tired to lie. When he finished, Walter nodded slowly, smoke curling from his pipe. "The land don't lie. Neither should a man. You're doing right." Helen leaned forward, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Women carry shame we don't deserve. Someone hurt that girl long before you knew her. Told her she wasn't enough. Sometimes a man's got to ride clear across the territory to tell her the truth." "What will you say when you find her?" Helen asked. Thomas thought about it, the words forming slowly like ice in winter. That she belongs, that we're waiting, that love don't quit just because someone's scared. Walter smiled into his beard. That'll do just fine." Thomas left at dawn. Helen packed extra provisions, pressed them into his hands despite his protests. "For when you bring her home," she said. Not if, when. The blessing warmed him more than the fire had. He rode into the day with her words following a gift more valuable than gold or supplies. The knowledge that somewhere in this hard country, 2 strangers believed in what he was doing. Believed it enough to say so. The next storm hit an hour later. Rain and wind and cold that cut through everything, the kind of weather that killed travelers, who were not careful, who did not respect the power of nature in high country. Thomas pushed through it because he had no choice. Grace was 3 days ahead, maybe less, if he rode hard. The line shack he found was barely shelter. 3 walls solid, one collapsed the roof, leaking in 3 places. But it was out of the wind, and that was enough. He built a small fire near the one good wall, tended his horse in the attached lean-to, then sat alone with the sound of rain hammering what remained of the roof. 10 days on the trail now. 3 more if the weather held, and his information was right. 3 more days to Sweetwater Creek. He pulled the letter from his coat. The paper had softened from handling the ink beginning to blur at the edges. He had read it 100 times since she sent it back, but he read it again now, speaking the words aloud to the empty room, to the rain, to whatever power listened to foolish men. Grace, Rose asks for you every night. I tell her you had to go, but I don't believe it. I think you're scared. I think someone told you once you weren't enough. They lied. Come home. We're waiting. Thomas. His voice was the only sound besides the rain, rough and tired, and carrying all the weight of 200 miles and 7 days of doubt. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. 3 more days. He would make it. Had to. But trouble was closing in. On the morning of the 9th day, as Thomas broke camp and prepared to ride, he heard it. Hoofbeats coming fast from the east. Not the sound of a traveler. The sound of someone with purpose. Thomas drew his rifle and waited. The rider came into view through the trees. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat dark with rain. The man reined in 30 feet away, hand resting on his own weapon, but not drawing. Thomas Brennan. It was not a question. Who's asking? Name's Jake Carver. I'm a bounty hunter, and there's paper on you. $500 dead or alive. Thomas felt his blood go cold. Frank Morrison. It had to be. I don't know what you've been told, but there's no bounty on me. Jake smiled, but there was no humor in it. Frank Morrison says different. Says you put him away 3 years back. Says he's got unfinished business. Frank's in prison. Was in prison. Broke out 6 months ago. And the first thing he did was put gold on your head. The rain fell between them, cold and relentless. Thomas kept his rifle steady finger near the trigger, but not on it. Not yet. So what now? Thomas asked. Now you come with me, or I put you down and take you back over your saddle. Your choice, but... Thomas thought of Rose waiting at home, thought of Grace 3 days ahead in a town that did not know a man was riding through hell to reach her. I can't do that, Thomas said quietly. I made a promise. Promises don't spend, friend. Gold does. Then I guess we have a problem. They moved at the same time. Thomas fired first, the crack of his rifle splitting the morning. The shot caught Jake in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. Jake's return fire went wide, missing Thomas by inches. Jake clutched his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. He looked at Thomas with something like respect. This ain't over, Brennan. It is today. Ride out or the next shot won't miss. Jake wheeled his horse and disappeared into the trees, leaving a trail of blood and rage behind. Thomas lowered his rifle hands, shaking from adrenaline and fear. He had made an enemy today. A wounded enemy was a dangerous enemy, his father used to say. Wounded men got mean, got desperate, got creative. But Thomas did not have time to worry about Jake Carver. He had a promise to keep, and every hour mattered now. He mounted his horse and rode west into country that grew rougher and colder with each mile. The mountains rose ahead, snow-capped and ancient, caring nothing for the struggles of men below. Thomas Brennan rode toward them anyway because a man's word was his bond, and because somewhere beyond those peaks a woman was hiding from the very thing she needed most. He would find her. He would tell her the truth. And whether she believed him or not, at least she would know. At least she would know that someone rode 300 miles through storms and bullets in doubt to tell her one simple thing. You belong. The sun set on the 13th day as Thomas Brennan rode into Sweetwater Creek. The town was small, barely more than a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the emptiness. One main street, a church, 2 saloons, a handful of shops. And somewhere in this place, Grace Merrick was hiding. Thomas stopped at the general store, mud-covered and exhausted, looking more like an outlaw than a man on a righteous errand. The shopkeeper eyed him with suspicion. I'm looking for a woman, Thomas said. Dark hair, quiet. Name's Grace Merrick. The shopkeeper's face changed just slightly. Don't know that name. Please, I've come a long way. Something in Thomas's voice must have convinced him because the man's expression softened. There's a seamstress, rents a room above Mrs. Porter's boarding house. She goes by Grace Hartley, not Merrick. White building at the end of the street. Thomas thanked him and rode to the boarding house, his heart pounding harder than it had when Jake Carver drew down on him. This was different. This was everything. He stood outside for a long moment, trying to steady his breathing, trying to find the right words. 2 weeks had led to this. Everything led to this. He climbed the steps and knocked. The woman who answered was older, gray-haired, with sharp eyes that assessed him immediately. Mrs. Porter, he assumed. Help you. My name's Thomas Brennan. I'm here to see Grace Hartley. Tell her I rode from Montana. The woman studied him a moment longer, then nodded. Wait here. She disappeared inside. Thomas stood on the porch, hat in hands, trying not to hope too hard, trying not to think about what would happen if she refused to see him. 5 minutes passed. They felt like hours. Mrs. Porter returned. Her expression told him everything before her words did. She says to go home. She won't see you. The words hit like a fist. Thomas stared at her, disbelieving. She won't see me. That's what she said. But can I just talk to her just for a moment? His voice cracked on the last word, all the exhaustion and desperation of 2 weeks finally breaking through. Mrs. Porter's face softened slightly. She glanced back toward the stairs, then at Thomas, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. She's crying up there. Has been since I told her you came. That's not a woman who wants you gone. That's a woman who thinks she doesn't deserve you to stay. Thomas looked up at the second-floor windows. One showed lamplight flickering. A shadow passed across it, brief but unmistakable. His heart broke and mended in the same moment. He walked down the steps, slowly stood in the street beside his horse. He could leave now, ride home, respect her wishes, tell Rose he had tried that sometimes trying was not enough. He looked up at her window again. Then he sat down on the boarding house steps. Mrs. Porter opened the door. What are you doing? Thomas looked at her steadily, his voice quiet but certain. Waiting. For what? As long as it takes. She studied him a long moment, then nodded once and then went back inside, closing the door softly behind her. Thomas settled against the railing, the wood hard beneath him, but he did not care. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening. People passed, gave him curious looks, moved on. He did not move, did not explain. Around midnight, Mrs. Porter brought him coffee. Around 2 in the morning, she brought a blanket. He accepted both gratefully, but did not move from his place on the steps. The lamplight in Grace's window never went out. She was not sleeping either. And so he waited. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and cold. The wind picked up, carrying the promise of winter. His muscles ached. His wound throbbed. His eyes grew heavy. But Thomas Brennan did not move from those steps. Because a man's word was his bond. Because he had promised Rose. Because somewhere behind that window, a woman was fighting the same battle he had fought for 2 weeks. The battle between fear and faith, between past and future, between the safety of loneliness and the risk of love. He would wait. He would show her that some men did not give up, that some promises were kept no matter the cost. He would wait as long as it took. And when dawn came pink and cold over the eastern mountains, Thomas Brennan was still there, still waiting, still believing that sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was simply refuse to leave. The night stretched endless and cold. Thomas sat on those boarding house steps as hours bled into each other, marked only by the slow wheel of stars overhead and the ache spreading through his bones. His back pressed against the railing. His legs had gone numb sometime after midnight. The coffee Mrs. Porter brought had long since cooled in his hands, but he did not move. The window above remained lit, a small square of yellow against the dark face of the building. Every so often a shadow would cross it, Grace pacing perhaps, or sitting, or standing at the glass looking down at the fool who would not leave. Let her look. Let her see that Montana men kept their promises. Around 3 in the morning, the cold became something alive, something with teeth. Thomas pulled the blanket tighter and thought about the trail that had brought him here. 2 weeks of riding, a shootout with a bounty hunter, a river that nearly claimed his life. All of it leading to this moment, this vigil, this test of will against fear. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the wooden horse smooth and solid. Rose's gift, Grace's creation, a circle of love carved in pine. His daughter's face came to him then small and trusting in the dawn light as he rode away. Papa will bring her home. That was the promise he had made, spoken and unspoken. And Thomas Brennan did not break promises. Not to his daughter, not to himself, and not to the woman hiding behind that lit window, the woman who had taught his child to read and planted gardens and made their house feel like a home again. The eastern sky began to pale, the stars fading one by one. Dawn was coming slow and inevitable as judgment. Thomas had been sitting for 9 hours. His body screamed for movement, for warmth, for rest. His mind whispered that this was madness, that no woman was worth this kind of suffering. But his heart, that stubborn muscle that had kept beating through Sarah's death and Rose's fever and 3 years of loneliness, his heart said stay. So he stayed. The door behind him opened. Thomas turned his head, expecting Mrs. Porter with more coffee or perhaps the sheriff with orders to move along. Instead, he saw Grace. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale with exhaustion and streaked with tears. Their eyes met, and the world narrowed to just that space between them, 3 feet that might as well have been 300 miles. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting, his muscles stiff from the cold and the waiting. But he stood because a man stood when a woman spoke to him, especially when that woman held his whole world in her next words. "I shouldn't have let you leave," he said. Silence stretched between them, electric and full of all the words they had not said, all the moments they had lost, all the fear and hope tangled together like roots beneath the earth. Grace's hand gripped the door frame as if she might fall without it. Her eyes, those dark eyes that had watched sunrise from his porch and laughed at Rose's stories and seen too much pain in too few years, those eyes were full of something Thomas could not name. "Come in," she said finally. "Please." But to understand what happened in that room above the boarding house, to know why Grace had run, and why she stood now on the edge of letting Thomas in, we must go back. Back to where her story truly began, in a time before Thomas, before Rose, before Sweetwater Creek. Back to when she was just a child, learning that love was something temporary, something that could be taken away. 200 miles east, while Thomas waited on those cold steps, another story was unfolding. A story that would collide with his before the sun set on another day. Jake Carver rode hard through the darkness, his left shoulder screaming with every movement of his horse. The bullet wound Thomas Brennan had given him was clean through and through, but it burned like hellfire and bled more than he liked. He had underestimated the former marshal. That would not happen again. Jake was 52 years old, and he had been hunting men for 30 of those years. Tracking was in his blood, inherited from a Shoshone mother who could read trail sign like white men read newspapers. He had learned patience from her, learned to see what others missed, learned that the best hunters were the ones who understood their prey. And Jake understood Thomas Brennan now. This was not a man running from the law. This was a man running towards something, or someone. The way he moved, the direction, he took the determination that showed in every choice he made on the trail. This was a man with purpose. Jake could respect that, even as he planned to kill him. $500 was $500, and Frank Morrison had promised double if Jake brought Brennan back alive, triple if he made him suffer first. Frank wanted revenge more than he wanted death, wanted to look the man who put him away in the eye and show him what happened to people who crossed him. But Jake was not a cruel man by nature. He would make it quick when the time came. Brennan had earned that much with that shoulder shot, with the way he moved and fought like a man who still remembered what it meant to be dangerous. First, though, Jake needed to heal, needed to bind this wound properly, get supplies, maybe find a doctor who did not ask too many questions. He knew a place 3 days north, a town where marshals did not go, and bounty hunters were just another kind of working man. He would rest there. Let Brennan think he had won, let him get comfortable in his quest. Then Jake would come for him fresh and ready, and this time there would be no mistakes. The hunt was not over. It was just beginning. Grace's room was small and spare, holding only the essentials for a life lived temporary. A bed with an iron frame, a table scarred with years of use, a single chair that wobbled when you sat in it, a washstand with a chipped basin. No pictures on the walls, no mementos on the dresser. Nothing that spoke of roots or permanence or a life meant to last. Thomas stood just inside the door, suddenly uncertain. This was her space, her refuge, and he felt like an intruder despite her invitation. Grace moved to the window and looked out at the street below, at the place where he had sat through the night. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that?" Thomas thought about the question, about all the answers he could give. "Because I promised Rose. Because I rode 300 miles and was not about to stop at 20 feet. Because I am stubborn and foolish and too old to learn better." But what he said was simpler, truer. "Because you matter." Grace's shoulders shook. She did not turn around, did not let him see her face, but he could hear the tears in her voice when she spoke again. "You don't know me. You don't know what I am." "Then tell me." She turned then, and the pain in her eyes was so raw it hurt to witness. "I'm someone who leaves. That's what I do. I find good things and I run from them, because I know they won't last. Better to leave first than wait to be sent away." "Who sent you away?" And there it was, the question that opened the wound, the door that led into the dark rooms of her past. Grace sat on the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and began to speak. "I was 5 when my parents died. Fever took them both within a week, mother first, and then father 3 days later. I remember the sound of his coughing, the way it filled the little house we lived in, the way it stopped suddenly one night, and the silence was worse than the noise. Her voice was flat, distant, the voice of someone recounting facts that happened to someone else. My Aunt Sarah took me in. She had 5 children already, but family was family, and in those days you did not turn away an orphan, even if you could barely feed the mouse you had. I stayed with her for a year. I tried to be good, tried to be helpful, tried to be invisible so I would not be a burden." Grace looked at her hands, at the fingers that had sewn and healed and carved wooden horses in firelight. "But I was a burden, another mouth to feed, another body to clothe. When winter came hard that year, Aunt Sarah made a choice. She sent me to her sister Margaret." Thomas listened without interrupting, sensing that this story needed to be told whole, that any break in its telling would make it harder to finish. "Aunt Margaret was childless. She thought maybe I would be a companion for her, someone to fill the empty spaces in her house. But I was 6 years old, and I did not know how to be what she needed. I was too slow at chores, too clumsy with the dishes, too loud when I played. After 8 months, she sent me to Cousin Thomas. The litany continued, each home a variation on the same theme. Cousin Thomas, whose wife thought Grace was bad luck, cursed by the death of both parents young. Uncle John, who drank too much and when he was sober resented having to feed a child that was not his. Uncle Robert, whose new wife was jealous of any attention her husband paid to anyone else. Cousin Elizabeth, who wanted an unpaid servant more than a family member. 7 homes before she was 15. 7 times being told in words or deeds or cold silences that she was not wanted, not loved, not enough. "I learned not to hope," Grace said. "I learned to keep my things in a bag, always ready to move. I learned not to make friends because I would just leave them. I learned that love was conditional, that it could be taken away, that I was not the kind of person who got to keep good things." Her eyes met Thomas's, and in them he saw the accumulated pain of those years, the wounds that had never properly healed. "So when I came to your ranch, when you and Rose were so kind, when it started to feel like home, I waited. Waited for the moment when you would realize I was not worth keeping. Waited for you to send me away like everyone else had. But I never did." "No, you never did, and that terrified me more than anything." Thomas moved then, slowly, carefully crossing the small room to sit in the wobbly chair near her bed. He wanted to reach for her hand, but did not, sensing she was not finished, that there was more to this story. "There's something else," Grace said. "Something I haven't told you." His name was Silas Cobb. Grace spoke it like a curse, like something bitter on the tongue. Thomas felt his hands tighten on the arms of the chair, old instincts rising, the marshal in him recognizing the tone of a victim speaking about her abuser. "When I was 15, I ran out of relatives willing to take me, but I needed work, needed a place to stay. I heard about a ranch owner looking for help. Silas Cobb. He seemed decent enough at first. Paid fair, treated me respectful, gave me a room in the back of the ranch house." Grace's voice went quieter, harder. "That lasted about a year. Then he started drinking, started looking at me differently, started saying things that made my skin crawl. One night he came to my room drunk, tried to force himself inside. I climbed out the window and ran." "Where did you go?" "Anywhere, everywhere. I learned healing from a woman in Denver, traveled with her for 2 years before she died." After that, I went from town to town, never staying long, never using my real name because I was afraid Silas would find me. Did he? Grace nodded, tears sliding down her face, now unchecked and unashamed. He found me in Montana, a week before I left your ranch. He rode up when you were out with the cattle when Rose was inside. He told me he would make trouble, would claim I stole from him, would have the law on me. Or worse, he said he would hurt Rose, just to punish me for running. Understanding crashed over Thomas like cold water. She had not left because she stopped caring. She had left to protect them. So you ran again. I always run. It's what I know how to do. Thomas leaned forward, his voice tense, urgent. And did running work? Did Silas forget about you? Grace looked away. No, he's here in Sweetwater Creek. I saw him 2 days ago. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the window in bars of gold and shadow. Voices rose from the street below the town, waking to another day. But in that small room, time seemed suspended, two people caught in a moment that would decide everything. Thomas stood and walked to the window. He looked down at the street, at the people passing, at the normal flow of a normal day in a small frontier town. Somewhere down there, Silas Cobb was walking around thinking he had won, thinking he had driven Grace into hiding forever. The marshal in Thomas, the part of him that had spent 15 years hunting men who hurt the innocent, that part wanted to find Silas right now and settle this the way such things were settled in hard country, quick and final and without mercy. But the man in him, the part that had learned patience watching his daughter grow, and gardens bloom and seasons turn, that part knew there was a better way. I'm not leaving, Thomas said, still looking out the window. Not without you. Tom, you don't understand. Silas will do nothing. Thomas turned to face her, and in his eyes was something Grace had never seen directed at her before. Not pity, not obligation, but fierce protective certainty. I dealt with men like Silas Cobb for 15 years. I know exactly what he is and what he can do, and I know he won't touch you. Not while I'm breathing. You can't promise that. I just did. Grace stood agitated, wrapping her arms around herself. You rode all this way, you sat on those steps all night, and for what? For someone who's going to bring you nothing but trouble, someone who runs at the first sign of danger. You didn't run from danger, you ran toward it. You took it away from Rose, from me, and you carried it alone because you thought that was noble. That was sacrifice. That was cowardice. No. Thomas crossed the room in 3 strides, and this time he did reach for her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. It was love. Misguided maybe, but love. And I'm here to tell you something that nobody else apparently ever told you. Grace looked up at him, her eyes wide and wet. You don't have to carry things alone. You don't have to run. You don't have to earn the right to be loved, because love is not something you earn. It's something you accept or reject. And I'm asking you to accept it. He reached into his coat and pulled out the wooden horse, held it between them like an offering, like a promise made solid. Rose made me bring this. She said to tell you we still have it. That we remember, that we're waiting. Grace took the horse with trembling hands, held it against her chest, and broke. The tears came in great shaking sobs, the kind that come from years of held-back grief, from a lifetime of believing you were not worth keeping. Thomas held her while she cried, saying nothing because there was nothing to say, just letting her empty out all the poison that had been killing her slowly for so long, 200 miles east. Rose Brennan sat on the porch of her father's ranch and watched the road. Martha Doyle sat beside her, mending a shirt, the needle moving in and out with practiced efficiency. The old woman glanced at the child every few minutes, saw the way Rose's eyes never left the eastern horizon, the way she held herself still, as if movement might somehow delay her father's return. He'll come back, child. I know. With or without Miss Grace, he'll come back. Rose was quiet for a long moment, then said in a voice too old for 7 years. But it won't be the same if he comes back alone. He'll be sad again, like after Mama died. Martha set down her sewing and looked at the girl. So young, but already she understood that some hurts did not heal with time, that some losses changed you forever. Your papa is a good man, Rose. One of the best I've known, and good men don't give up easy. Miss Grace is scared, Papa told me so. Scared of what? That we'll send her away. like other people did. Rose picked at the wood of the porch, her small fingers tracing old scars in the pine. But we wouldn't do that. We love her. Martha smiled, sad and proud all at once. Love is a complicated thing when you've been hurt. Sometimes the people who need it most are the ones most afraid of it. Why bitaem? Because if you never let yourself love something, it can't hurt you when it goes away. Rose thought about this, her young mind working through ideas too heavy for childhood. Finally, she said, but that's silly. Not loving things doesn't stop you from hurting. It just means you hurt alone. Martha looked at the girl with something like awe. Out of the mouths of babes, the good book said, sometimes wisdom came from the strangest places. You're right, child. You're absolutely right. They sat in silence watching the road, waiting for a man who had ridden into the teeth of storms and danger to prove that some promises were worth keeping, some loves were worth the risk. In Sweetwater Creek, in a room above a boarding house, Thomas Brennan pulled a letter from his coat. The envelope was worn now, softened by handling and water and the miles it had traveled. He held it out to Grace. I wrote this 3 weeks after you left. You sent it back unopened. I want you to know what it says. Grace looked at the letter like it might burn her. Tom, I can't. You don't have to read it, just listen. He unfolded the paper, smoothed it against his knee, and read aloud in that room with the morning light streaming through the window. Grace, Rose asks for you every night. I tell her you had to go, but I don't believe it. I think you're scared. I think someone told you once you weren't enough. They lied. His voice caught, but he pushed through. You belong here with us, with Rose, with me. I'm not asking you to love me, not asking you to promise forever. I'm just asking you to come home. Just once more, so you can see that we haven't changed, that you still belong. We're waiting. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with meaning. Grace held the wooden horse against her chest, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. What if I disappoint you, she whispered. What if I'm not what you think I am? Then we'll figure it out together. But Grace, you could never disappoint me. Leaving disappointed me. Running disappointed me. Because it meant you didn't trust that what we had was real. I didn't trust that I was real, that I was the kind of person who got to have that. Thomas reached out and lifted her chin gently, made her look at him. You are that kind of person. You are exactly that kind of person. And I rode 300 miles through hell to tell you so. Grace searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was temporary or conditional. She found none. What she found instead was certainty, solid as stone, patient as the mountains. I'm afraid, she said. I know. But fear is not a good enough reason to run from love. And make no mistake, Grace, I love you. I have loved you since I watched you braid my daughter's hair and laugh at her stories and stand in my doorway at sunrise like you were meant to be there. Grace started to speak, to protest, to list all the reasons this was impossible. But Thomas shook his head. You don't have to suit it back. You don't have to promise anything. Just come home with me, give it a chance. If it doesn't work, if you still want to run, then I'll let you go, but at least give it a chance. The moment stretched between them, taut as a bowstring, everything balanced on what came next. Grace looked at the wooden horse in her hands, at the man who had sat on cold steps all night, just to prove he meant what he said, at the life she had been running from, because she thought she did not deserve it. Okay, she said so quietly he almost missed it. Okay, I'll come home. But the world, it seemed, had other plans. The door burst open and Mrs. Porter stood there, her face pale, her breathing hard. Grace, there's a man downstairs. He's asking for you. Says his name is Silas Cobb. Grace went rigid, all the color draining from her face. Thomas felt her hand tighten on his arm, felt the fear roll off her in waves. Stay here, he said. Tom, no, he's dangerous. So am I. Thomas Brennan walked down those stairs with 15 years of law enforcement in his spine and something more dangerous than experience driving him. He walked down those stairs with the knowledge that the woman upstairs, the woman he loved, had been hurt by the man waiting below. And there was an old justice in frontier country, older than law books and courtrooms, a justice that said some debts were paid in blood and bone. Silas Cobb stood in the parlor of the boarding house, swaying slightly, whiskey on his breath, even at this early hour. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of meanness that came from hurting things weaker than himself. He looked up when Thomas appeared on the stairs and his eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm the man who's about to tell you to leave." Silas laughed, the sound ugly and full of mockery. "Grace sends you, that little bitch owes me 2 years' wages. I got every right to be here." Thomas reached the bottom of the stairs, and something in his walk, something in the way he carried himself, made Silas's laughter die. "You got 3 seconds to walk out that door and keep walking. After that, what happens is on you." "You threatening me?" "I'm promising you." Silas's hand moved toward his belt, toward the knife Thomas could see there. But Thomas had not been a marshal for nothing. He had not survived 15 years of tracking dangerous men without learning how to read violence before it happened. He moved first. Thomas closed the distance in 2 steps, caught Silas's wrist before the knife cleared its sheath and twisted. Bone cracked. Silas howled. The knife clattered to the floor. Thomas swept Silas's legs out from under him and put him on the ground hard, then planted a knee in his chest and leaned down close. "You listening?" Silas, pain and fear finally replacing the bravado, nodded. "Grace is leaving this town. She's going back to Montana with me. You're going to forget you ever knew her. You're going to forget her name, forget her face, forget she exists. Because if I hear you've come within 100 miles of her, if I hear you've so much as spoken her name, I will come for you. And next time I won't be so gentle." Thomas looked at Mrs. Porter, who had watched the whole thing with tight lips and approving eyes. "Thank you for your hospitality, ma'am. We'll be leaving today." He climbed the stairs back to Grace's room, left Silas Cobb moaning on the floor behind him, and did not look back. Grace was at the window, her face pressed against the glass, watching. When Thomas entered, she turned to him with eyes full of questions. "Is he?" "He's leaving, and he won't bother you again." "How can you be sure?" Thomas showed her his bloodied knuckles, the price of making promises he intended to keep. "Because he knows what happens if he does." Grace crossed the room and took his hand, examined the damage with healer's eyes, then looked up at him with something new in her face. Not just gratitude, not just relief, but the first fragile shoots of trust pushing up through soil that had been barren too long. "Thank you. Pack your things. We leave in an hour." "That's soon. I've been away from Rose too long, and I want to get you home before winter sets in proper." Home. The word hung in the air between them, no longer a threat, but a promise. Grace nodded and began gathering her few possessions while Thomas went to prepare the horses. He stepped out into the street, and the morning sun felt the warmth of it on his face, and for the first time in 2 weeks allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would actually work. He had ridden 300 miles. He had faced a bounty hunter. He had nearly drowned. He had sat through a night of cold and doubt, and now he was bringing Grace home. But the trail back would not be easy. Jake Carver was still out there, and wounded pride made men do desperate things. The weather was turning winter, coming early to the high country, and Grace, despite her agreement, was still afraid, still learning to trust. The journey was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. Thomas Brennan looked west toward home, toward his daughter, waiting on a porch, toward a future he had dared to hope for. Despite all reason and logic, he smiled. A man's word was his bond, and he had kept his word. Now came the harder part. Now came the keeping of it every day through seasons and years, and all the small moments that made a life. But as Thomas saddled the horses and waited for Grace to come down, as he felt the wooden horse solid in his pocket, and thought of Rose's face when she saw them riding home together, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and that made all the difference. They left Sweetwater Creek as the sun climbed toward noon, 2 horses side by side on the eastern road. Grace sat straight in her saddle, the mare Mrs. Porter had insisted she take moving steady beneath her. She wore a traveling dress the landlady had given her, practical and worn but clean, and her few possessions were tied in a bundle behind her saddle. Everything she owned in the world fit in a bag smaller than a feed sack. Thomas rode beside her on Duke the bay gelding that had carried him 300 miles and back. The horse knew the way home, knew it in his bones, the way animals know such things, and his ears were pricked, forward eager. But Thomas kept the pace measured, unhurried. Grace was still fragile, still processing what she had agreed to. Every few miles he would glance at her, checking, making sure she had not changed her mind, making sure she was real, and this was real, and they were truly riding home together. The first hour passed in silence, comfortable enough. Grace watched the country roll by the high plains, giving way slowly to foothills, the autumn grass golden in the sunlight. It was beautiful in a stark way, this land demanding and unforgiving, but honest. The mountains rose ahead, their peaks already white with early snow. "How long will it take?" Grace asked finally, her voice small against the vastness. "5 days if the weather holds, maybe 6. That's faster than your journey here. I know the way now, and I'm not stopping to ask directions or wait out storms in line shacks." He paused, then added softly, "And I have a reason to get home quick." Grace looked at him, questions in her eyes. "Rose," Thomas said, "she's been without both of us too long. And she's waiting. She knows I went to find you, knows I wouldn't come back without trying everything. What if she's angry with me for leaving?" "Rose doesn't have anger in her. Not for people she loves. She has hope, though. So much hope it scares me sometimes." Grace was quiet, thinking about the little girl she had taught to read, the child who had called her almost mama, once before catching herself. The memory was sweet and sharp all at once. "I missed her," Grace said. "Every day. I miss both of you." "Then why did you send the letter back?" It was the first time Thomas had asked directly, and Grace owed him an answer. She took a breath, gathering the words. "Because I thought if I read it, I wouldn't be able to stay away. And I thought I had to stay away to keep you safe from Silas. But more than that," she struggled, trying to articulate something she barely understood herself. "I thought if I read your words, if I let myself hope, and then it all fell apart anyway, it would hurt worse than anything before. So I sent it back. Told myself I was being strong. But you weren't." "No, I was being a coward." Thomas reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. The touch was brief, just a moment of connection, but it steadied something in Grace that had been unsteady too long. "You're here now. That's what matters." They rode on, and the silence between them grew warmer, easier. Grace found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the ride, into the solid presence of the man beside her, into the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this could work. But the world had not finished testing them yet. 3 days into their journey, as they crossed through a narrow pass in the mountains, Grace saw Thomas's whole body go tense. His hand moved to his rifle, and his eyes scanned the rocks above them with the practiced alertness of a man who had lived with danger. "What is it?" Grace asked, her own fear rising. "We're being followed." "Silas." "No, someone else. Someone who's been tracking us since we left Sweetwater Creek." Grace felt ice in her stomach. "How long have you known?" "Since yesterday morning. Hoped I was wrong, but—" He pointed to a ridge behind them. For just a moment, Grace saw it. A figure on horseback, too far away to make out details, but their real following. "Who?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "A bounty hunter named Jake Carver. There's a price on my head put there by a man I sent to prison 3 years back. Jake and I had a disagreement on the trail west. I thought I'd convinced him to let it go." "You shot him." "He shot at me first." Thomas glanced at her. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry, but looks like he's healed up and come back." Grace felt anger and fear warring in her chest. After everything, after Thomas had risked so much to find her, now this. "What do we do?" "We keep riding, make for that stand of rocks ahead, take cover if we need to, but Grace, listen to me." He turned in his saddle, his gray eyes intense. "If shooting starts, you run. You take that mare, and you ride for home, and you don't look back. You hear me? I'm not leaving you. You will if I tell you to. Promise me." Grace looked at him, at the determination in his face, the fear underneath it that was not for himself but for her. She thought about all the people in her life who had sent her away, who had made her leave. But this was different. This was not rejection. This was protection. "I promise," she said, though the words tasted like ash. They rode faster now, pushing the horses, making for the shelter of the rocks. The sun was falling toward the western horizon, painting everything gold in shadow. Behind them, the rider was closer, no longer trying to hide. Thomas and Grace reached the rocks as the sun touched the mountaintops. Thomas dismounted fast, pulled Grace down, and positioned the horses behind the largest boulder. He checked his rifle, his movements efficient, practiced. "Stay low," he said, "and remember your promise." Then they waited. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the stone walls of the pass. Grace crouched behind the boulder, her heart hammering, her hands shaking. She had never been near violence like this, had spent her life running from conflicts, not facing them. But Thomas stood calm as stone rifle-ready eyes tracking the approaching rider. Whatever came, he would meet it standing. That was who he was. The rider came into view, and Grace saw him clearly for the first time. A tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a long coat, dark with travel dust. His left arm hung stiff, favoring it, and she knew this was where Thomas's bullet had struck. Jake Carver. He stopped 50 feet away, hands visible, not reaching for his weapon. But Grace could see the gun at his hip, could see the rifle strapped to his saddle, could see the calculation in his eyes as he studied Thomas's position. "Brennan," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "Carver, you got yourself a woman now. That's what this was all about. That's none of your concern." Jake was silent for a moment, then said something Grace did not expect. "My wife left me 5 years back. Couldn't stand what I'd become," she said. "The hunting, the killing, the nights I didn't come home." He shifted in his saddle, and Grace saw pain cross his face, not from his wound, but from something deeper. She was right to leave. I was a bastard, then worse now. Thomas did not lower his rifle. "That's a sad story, but it doesn't change what you came here to do." "No, it doesn't." Jake looked past Thomas, saw Grace watching from behind the boulder. "But seeing you two, seeing what a man will ride through for a woman, it makes me think. Makes me remember what I used to be before the hunting took over." "What are you saying, Carver?" Jake reached slowly into his coat, and Thomas tensed. But what Jake pulled out was not a weapon. It was a piece of paper, official looking with writing on it. He held it up so Thomas could see. "This here's the bounty notice on you. $500 from Frank Morrison wants you brought back alive, if possible." Jake tore the paper in half, then in half again, let the pieces fall to the ground. "But Frank Morrison can go to hell. I'm too old for this, too tired, and you gave me something nobody else has in a long time." "What's that?" "A choice. You could have killed me when we fought. Should have if you were smart, but you didn't. You gave me a chance to walk away." Jake touched his wounded shoulder. "This has been healing, and while it healed, I had time to think about what I'm doing with the years I got left, about whether I want to die alone in some nameless place, chasing bounties that don't mean nothing." Thomas lowered his rifle slightly, sensing something shifting in the air between them. Jake looked at Grace again, then back to Thomas. "You got something worth living for. Something worth fighting for. I had that once, and I threw it away because I thought the hunt was more important. Don't make my mistake, Brennan." "I don't intend to." "Then go. Take your woman home. Forget about Frank Morrison and forget about me. I'll tell him I lost your trail, that you disappeared into the mountains, and I couldn't track you. He'll believe it because he wants to believe. It wants an excuse to keep me on his payroll chasing ghosts." Thomas studied Jake for a long moment, reading the sincerity in his weathered face, the exhaustion of a man who had reached the end of something. "Why should I trust you? Because I just threw away $500. Because I'm sitting here talking instead of shooting. And because, God help me, I see something in your eyes when you look at that woman. Something I used to have and didn't know how to keep." The wind whistled through the paths, cold and sharp with the promise of winter. Grace watched both men, hardly daring to breathe, knowing that whatever happened next would determine whether they made it home or died here among the rocks. Finally, Thomas nodded. "All right, you let us pass. We forget this happened." "Fair enough." Jake gathered his reins, preparing to turn his horse. But before he did, he said one more thing. "Brennan, that woman you got there, she's running from something. I can see it in how she holds herself. Whatever she's running from, don't let her. Make her stand. Make her see she's worth keeping. Because the running never stops unless someone makes you stop." Then Jake Carver wheeled his horse and rode back the way he came, disappearing into the lengthening shadows. Thomas and Grace stood in silence, watching until he was gone, neither quite believing what had just happened. Grace came out from behind the boulder, her legs shaky. "That was the bounty hunter, the one who shot at you. That was him. He just let us go." "He did." Thomas looked down at the torn pieces of paper scattered on the ground, then up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to show. "Maybe there's more good in the world than I thought. Or maybe he was just tired. Either way, we're alive, and he's gone." Grace felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of tension she had been carrying since Sweetwater Creek. This man, this Tom Brennan, who had ridden through storms and bullets to find her, who had faced down Silas Cobb and Jake Carver To keep her safe, he was real. This was not a dream or a mistake or something that would dissolve like morning mist. This was real. She reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his, and felt the calluses there, the strength, the warmth. "Take me home, Tom." He smiled, and in that smile was every promise he had made and every one he intended to keep. "Yes, ma'am." They rode through the evening and made camp as darkness fell, finding a sheltered spot among the pines where the wind could not reach them. Thomas built a small fire while Grace unpacked the food Mrs. Porter had given them. Bread, dried meat, coffee enough for the journey home. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them, and for the first time since leaving Sweetwater Creek, Grace felt something like peace settle over her. The stars came out thick overhead, more stars than she had ever seen, diamonds scattered across black velvet. "Tell me about Rose," Grace said. "Tell me what she's been doing while I was gone." Thomas smiled, his face softening the way it always did when he spoke of his daughter. "She learned to gather eggs without getting pecked by that mean rooster. She's been practicing her reading every night, even though Martha can barely read herself. And she asks about you constantly. Where did Miss Grace go? When is she coming back? Does she remember me?" Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I never forgot her. Not for a moment. I know, but she needs to hear it from you. What if I don't know how to be what she needs? What if I'm no good at this?" Thomas reached across the fire and took her hand again. His touch, gentle but firm. "Grace, you already were what she needed. You were it all summer. The only thing that changed was you got scared and ran. But you're coming back now. That's what matters." "I'm still scared." "So am I. Being a parent is terrifying. You're responsible for this little life, this person who trusts you completely, and you know you're going to make mistakes and hurt them and fail them in 100 small ways. But you do it anyway because the alternative is worse. The alternative is not trying." Grace looked at him across the firelight, this man who had been a marshal and was now a rancher, who had lost a wife and raised a daughter alone, who had ridden 300 miles because he made a promise. She saw the scars on his hands and the lines around his eyes, and the silver in his hair, saw all the ways life had marked him, and she thought he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I love you," she said, the words coming out before she could think about them, before fear could stop her. Thomas went very still. "Say that again." "I love you, Tom Brennan. I think I've loved you since the day you let me into your home, since you didn't ask questions or demand payment, since you trusted me with your daughter. I was just too afraid to admit it." He stood and came around the fire, knelt beside her, and cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears on her cheeks. "I love you too. Have loved you since I watched you save Rose's life, since you planted that garden and taught her to read, and stood in my doorway at sunrise like you were meant to be there. I rode 300 miles to tell you that, and I'll ride 300 more if that's what it takes to make you believe it." Then he kissed her, gentle and sure, a promise made with lips instead of words. Grace kissed him back, tasting coffee and smoke, and something sweeter than both, tasting hope and possibility, and the future she had never dared to want. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Grace rested her forehead against his. "Take me home," she whispered. "Please, I want to go home." The next 3 days passed in a blur of riding and talking and growing more comfortable with each other. They spoke of small things and large things, of childhoods and dreams and fears. Thomas told her about Sarah, about the guilt he still carried, about how loving Grace felt like a second chance he did not deserve, but was grateful for anyway. Grace told him more about her years of wandering, about the people she had helped, and the towns she had passed through, about the loneliness that had been her constant companion. And slowly, mile by mile, hour by hour, she began to believe that maybe this time would be different, that maybe she had finally found a place where she could stop running. On the 5th day, as they crested the final ridge, Thomas pointed to the valley below. "There, that's home." Grace looked down at the ranch spread out beneath them, the house small but solid, smoke rising from the chimney, the barn and corral, the pastures where cattle grazed. And on the porch, a small figure stood, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, watching the road. Rose. Even from this distance, Grace could see the moment the girl recognized them, could see her go rigid with shock, then explode into motion, running down the porch steps, running across the yard, running toward them with her arms outstretched and her voice carrying on the wind. Papa, Miss Grace, you came back. Thomas spurred his horse faster, and Grace followed the mare, breaking into a gallop. They thundered down the slope, and Grace's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. They reached the yard, and Thomas barely had time to dismount before Rose launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his waist, sobbing into his coat. He lifted her up, held her close, murmuring words Grace could not hear. Then Rose pulled back and looked past her father, looked at Grace still sitting on her horse, and the hope and fear and desperate love in that little face broke Grace's heart and remade it all at once. Grace dismounted, her legs shaky, and took 2 steps forward. Then Rose was running to her, and Grace dropped to her knees and caught the girl in her arms, held her tight, felt those small hands clutching at her dress. "You came back," Rose sobbed. "Papa said you would, but I was so scared you wouldn't. I'm here, sweetness. I'm here. Are you staying? Really staying?" Grace looked up at Thomas, saw him watching them with eyes wet and bright. She looked down at Rose, at this child who had given her a wooden horse and trusted her father to bring her home. "Yes," Grace said, her voice strong and certain. "I'm staying, I promise." Rose pulled back, her face streaked with tears, but smiling. "Can you still teach me to read and help me with the garden and tell me stories at bedtime?" "Yes to all of it. Yes to everything." Rose threw her arms around Grace's neck again, and Grace held this child who was not hers by blood, but was hers in every way that mattered. Held her and cried and thanked whatever power had given her this second chance. Martha Doyle came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, smiling. "Looks like you found her." Thomas grinned. "I did." "Good. Now get inside, all of you. Supper's almost ready, and I imagine you're both starving." That evening they sat around the kitchen table, the 4 of them eating Martha's stew and bread. Rose talked nonstop, telling Grace everything that had happened in the 2 months she had been gone. The chickens had babies. The mean rooster finally got eaten by a fox. Martha's cooking was terrible compared to Grace's, a fact Martha agreed with wholeheartedly. Grace listened and laughed and felt the pieces of her broken heart knitting back together, cell by cell, moment by moment. She caught Thomas's eye across the table, saw the love there, the pride, the relief. After dinner, after Rose had finally exhausted herself with talking and fallen asleep in her chair, Thomas carried her to bed. Grace followed, watched as he tucked his daughter in, watched the gentleness of his hands, the love in every gesture. When he turned, Grace was standing in the doorway, and the look that passed between them needed no words. They walked out onto the porch into the cool October evening. The stars were out, brilliant and cold, and the mountains stood black against the sky. Grace leaned against Thomas, and his arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up, for riding all that way, for sitting on those steps all night, for everything. A man's word is his bond. I told you that you belonged. Had to prove it. You did. You proved it." Grace turned to face him, her hands on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palms. "What happens now? Now we live. We take care of Rose's work, the ranch, get through winter. In the spring, if you want, we can talk about making this permanent. A wedding, I mean. If that's something you'd want." Grace felt a flutter of panic's old instincts rising, but she pushed them down, looked at this man who had given her everything and asked for nothing in return, and knew the answer. "I'd want that. Very much." Thomas smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Each kiss a promise kept and a new promise made. They stood on that porch as the night deepened, 2 people who had been broken in different ways finding wholeness in each other. Inside the house, Rose slept peacefully for the first time in months, dreaming of gardens and wooden horses and the woman who had promised to stay. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal. The mountains stood, watched, silent witnesses to every joy and sorrow played out in their shadow. And in a small ranch house in Montana territory, a family knit itself together, stitch by careful stitch, choosing each other over fear, choosing love over safety, choosing to believe that some things, some precious things, were worth the risk. 23 years later, in that same house on a winter afternoon, an old man sat by the fire and finished his story. Thomas Brennan, now 67, looked at his grandson James and smiled. The boy held the wooden horse in his hands, turning it over, examining the careful carving, the smoothness worn by years of handling. So Grandma did stay, James said. She did. And we got married that next spring in the little church in town. Rose was our flower girl, 8 years old and so proud. Rose, now 30, and expecting her second child, wiped tears from her eyes. I remember, I wore a yellow dress and I got to hold Grandma's bouquet. Did the bounty hunter ever come back? James asked. No, Jake Carver kept his word. We never saw him again. And Silas Cobb, Thomas's face hardened. He tried once about 2 years later. Rode up to the ranch drunk and mean looking for trouble. But he found something else instead. What? Me and a wife who knew how to shoot as well as I did. We ran him off together and he never came back after that. Died a few years later, I heard. Liver gave out from all that drinking. Grace came in from the kitchen carrying a tray with coffee and cookies. At 52, her hair was streaked with silver, but her eyes were the same dark, deep eyes Thomas had fallen in love with all those years ago. She set the tray down and sat beside her husband, her hand finding his automatically. Are you telling the story again? She asked, smiling. James wanted to know about the horse. Grace picked it up, held it like the treasure it was. I carved this for Rose the summer before I ran away. I was so afraid, so certain that I didn't deserve the happiness I'd found. It took your grandfather riding 300 miles through hell to show me I was wrong. And sitting on those steps all night, Rose added, and facing down Silas Cobb and Jake Carver, Thomas said, and refusing to give up when any sane man would have, Grace finished. James looked at his grandparents, at the way their hands were intertwined, at the history written in the lines of their faces and the love in their eyes. That's the best story I ever heard. Thomas ruffled the boy's hair. It's not just a story, son. It's the truth. And the truth is love is worth fighting for. Worth riding for. Worth risking everything for. Because at the end of all the miles and all the fear and all the doubt, if you end up with the person you love, then it was all worth it. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat there by the fire, surrounded by family, remembering the journey that had brought them to this moment. The letter returned to sender. The vigil on coal steps. The ride home through mountain passes. All of it leading here to this warm room, to these people they loved. Outside, snow began to fall soft and silent, covering the world in white. Inside, the fire crackled, and a boy held a wooden horse, and an old couple held each other, and the past and present wove together into something stronger than memory. This was what Thomas had ridden 300 miles to find. Not just Grace, though she was the center of it, but this, family, home, belonging. The knowledge that when you love someone truly, when you made a promise and kept it, you built something that lasted, something that endured through seasons and years and all the small moments that made a life, something worth every hard mile. Grace looked at the wooden horse in James's hands and thought about the girl she had been so afraid of, love so certain she would lose anything good. She thought about the summer she had run and the man who had refused to let her go and the daughter who had trusted them both to find their way home. Thank you, she whispered to Thomas, too quiet for the others to hear. For what? For not giving up on me. Thomas kissed her temple, his lips gentle against her hair. Never did, never will. And as the snow fell and the fire burned, and their family filled the room with warmth and laughter, Grace Brennan closed her eyes and knew finally and completely that she was home. Not just in this house, not just in this valley, but in the hearts of the people she loved. Home in a way that could not be taken away because it was built on promises kept and love proven and the simple, stubborn faith of a man who believed she was worth finding. The wooden horse sat on the table, a testament to where they had been and what they had survived. A reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stop running, was let yourself be found, was trust that the love being offered was real and lasting and meant for you. Grace had spent most of her life learning that lesson, but she had the rest of her life to live it. And that she thought as Thomas's arms tightened around her and Rose laughed at something James said was more than she had ever dared to hope for. It was everything. The stars wheeled overhead. The mountains stood eternal. And in a small ranch house in Montana now and then, and always love had won. A man had ridden 300 miles to prove it. A woman had found the courage to believe it. A child had hoped for it. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.